In the summer of 2008, a story emerged from Orlando, Florida, that would captivate the American public and become one of the most controversial criminal cases of the 21st century. The disappearance and death of 2-year-old Kaylee Marie Anthony, and the subsequent trial of her mother Casey Anthony, divided public opinion like few cases before it. The case would ultimately expose the complexities of the American criminal justice system, the power of media coverage in shaping public perception, and the challenges of proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt in circumstantial evidence cases. Casey Marie Anthony, a 22-year-old single mother, became the focus of a media firestorm when her daughter Kaylee was reported missing after 31 days of unexplained absence. The case evolved from a missing child investigation into a murder trial that gripped the nation, culminating in a verdict that shocked millions of Americans who had followed the proceedings. The story of Casey Anthony and the mysterious death of Kaylee raises profound questions about motherhood, responsibility, justice, and the sometimes stark difference between moral culpability and legal guilt. This comprehensive examination explores the background of the Anthony family, the events leading up to Kaylee's disappearance, the massive search effort that followed, the discovery of the child's remains, the extensive investigation, and the trial that would become a cultural phenomenon. It also analyzes the aftermath of the case and its lasting impact on American society, the criminal justice system, and our understanding of how high-profile cases are prosecuted and perceived in the modern media age. Casey Marie Anthony was born on March 19, 1986, in Warren, Ohio, to George and Cindy Anthony. The family later relocated to Orlando, Florida, where George worked in law enforcement and security while Cindy pursued a career in nursing. From the outside, the Anthonys appeared to be a typical middle-class American family, but beneath the surface lay a complex web of family dynamics that would prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. Casey's childhood and adolescence were marked by what family members and friends later described as a pattern of lying and attention-seeking behavior. Even as a young child, Casey displayed a remarkable ability to fabricate elaborate stories and maintain deceptions for extended periods. Her parents, particularly her mother Cindy, often enabled this behavior by covering for Casey's lies and protecting her from the consequences of her actions. During her teenage years, Casey's behavior became increasingly problematic. She was caught stealing money from family members and friends, often lying about her whereabouts and activities. Despite these issues, she was popular among her peers and was known for her outgoing personality and party-loving lifestyle. She graduated from high school in 2004, though her academic performance was mediocre and her attendance was sporadic. The family dynamics within the Anthony household were characterized by conflict and dysfunction. George Anthony, despite his background in law enforcement, was often described as passive and ineffective in dealing with Casey's behavioral problems. Cindy Anthony, on the other hand, was controlling and overprotective, yet simultaneously enabling of Casey's irresponsible behavior. The couple's marriage was strained, and there were allegations of financial problems and infidelity that created additional tension within the household. In 2005, Casey shocked her family by announcing that she was pregnant. She had managed to conceal her pregnancy until she was nearly 7 months along, another example of her ability to maintain elaborate deceptions. The identity of the baby's father was unclear, with Casey providing different stories to different people about who had fathered her child. Kaylee Marie Anthony was born on August 9, 2005, at Florida Hospital in Orlando. Despite the circumstances of her conception and the family turmoil surrounding her birth, Kaylee quickly became the center of the Anthony family's world. George and Cindy Anthony were devoted grandparents who doted on the little girl, and she brought a measure of joy and stability to the troubled household. From the beginning, Kaylee's care was shared among the adult members of the Anthony family. Casey, who was only 19 when Kaylee was born, was unprepared for the responsibilities of motherhood and relied heavily on her parents for support. Cindy Anthony, in particular, took on much of the day-to-day care of Kaylee, effectively serving as a second mother to the child. Casey's approach to motherhood was inconsistent and often irresponsible. While she could be loving and attentive to Kaylee at times, she also resented the restrictions that caring for a child placed on her social life. She frequently left Kaylee with her parents while she went out partying with friends, sometimes staying away for days at a time without explanation. The question of Kaylee's paternity remained unresolved throughout her short life. Casey provided different stories about the father's identity to different people, claiming at various times that he was a young man who had died in a car accident, a high school boyfriend, or other individuals who later denied having any relationship with her. DNA testing after Kaylee's death would fail to identify the biological father, adding another layer of mystery to the case. Despite the dysfunction in Casey's personal life, Kaylee appeared to be a happy, healthy, and well-loved child. She was described by family, friends and neighbors as bright, energetic, and affectionate. Photos and videos from her early years show a smiling, playful little girl who was clearly cherished by her grandparents and, at least some of the time, by her mother. The Anthony household during Kaylee's early years was characterized by ongoing tension between Casey and her parents. Cindy Anthony was increasingly frustrated with Casey's irresponsible behavior and her failure to take on appropriate parental responsibilities. George Anthony, caught between his wife and daughter, struggled to maintain peace in the household while dealing with his own personal and financial problems. The events leading up to Kaylee's disappearance in June 2008 were characterized by escalating family conflict and Casey's increasingly erratic behavior. In the weeks before Kaylee vanished, tensions in the Anthony household had reached a breaking point. Cindy Anthony had discovered that Casey had been stealing money from her grandfather's nursing home account, leading to a violent confrontation between mother and daughter. On June 15, 2008, Casey and Kaylee left the Anthony family home following another heated argument with Cindy. This would be the last time that Cindy and George Anthony would see their granddaughter alive, though they would not realize this fact for more than a month. Casey told her parents that she was going to stay with friends and would bring Kaylee back when things calmed down. What actually happened to Kaylee during the 31 days that followed remains one of the central mysteries of the case. Casey's own accounts of this period were inconsistent and constantly changing, making it impossible to determine with certainty what occurred. She claimed at various times that Kaylee was with a babysitter named Zenaida Gonzalez, who was later determined not to exist, that she had been kidnapped, or that she had died in an accidental drowning. During this month-long period, Casey exhibited behavior that would later be scrutinized extensively during her trial. Rather than appearing distraught about her missing daughter, she was seen partying with friends, getting tattoos, and engaging in a casual sexual relationship. Photos from this period show her smiling and apparently carefree, behavior that many found inconsistent with that of a mother whose child was missing. Casey's friends later testified that during this period, she seemed normal and never mentioned that Kaylee was missing or in danger. She continued to claim that Kaylee was with the babysitter and would even show friends photos of the child on her phone, maintaining the fiction that everything was normal. This behavior would later be crucial evidence in the prosecution's case against her. Meanwhile, Casey's parents were growing increasingly concerned about their inability to contact Kaylee. Casey provided a series of explanations for why they couldn't speak to their granddaughter, including claims that the babysitter had taken Kaylee on various trips and vacations. George and Cindy Anthony's frustration grew as their repeated requests to see or speak with Kaylee were met with ever more elaborate excuses. The case officially began on July 15, 2008, when Cindy Anthony made a series of frantic 911 calls to report that her granddaughter was missing. The calls, which would later become crucial evidence in the case, captured Cindy's growing panic and Casey's suspicious behavior when confronted about Kaylee's whereabouts. In the first 911 call, made earlier in the day, Cindy reported that Casey's car had been recovered from a tow yard and that it smelled like a dead body had been inside. This detail would prove to be significant throughout the investigation and trial. However, it was the second call that evening that truly launched the case into the public consciousness. In the evening call, Cindy Anthony told the 911 operator that Kaylee had been missing for 31 days and that Casey had finally admitted that she didn't know where the child was. The desperation in Cindy's voice and the shocking revelation that a 2-year-old had been missing for over a month without being reported immediately attracted media attention and law enforcement interest. When Orange County Sheriff's Office deputies arrived at the Anthony home, they found a chaotic scene. Casey Anthony appeared calm and detached, a demeanor that immediately raised suspicions among the responding officers. When questioned about Kaylee's disappearance, Casey provided a story that would prove to be the first of many inconsistent accounts. Casey claimed that she had left Kaylee with a babysitter named Zenaida Zenny Gonzalez on June 16, 2008, and that when she returned to pick up her daughter, both Zenaida and Kaylee were gone. She said she had been searching for them ever since but hadn't contacted police because Zenaida had threatened to harm Kaylee if she involved law enforcement. This initial story immediately raised red flags for investigators. Casey's inability to provide a valid address for the babysitter, her vague descriptions of their relationship, and her calm demeanor when discussing her missing daughter all suggested deception. When detectives attempted to verify Casey's story, they found that the address she provided for Zenaida was a vacant apartment, and no one matching the description could be located. As the investigation into Kaylee's disappearance intensified, Casey Anthony's elaborate web of lies began to unravel. Each attempt by law enforcement to verify her story revealed new inconsistencies and fabrications, painting a picture of someone who was pathologically dishonest and potentially dangerous. Casey's claims about her employment were among the first to be disproven. She told investigators that she worked at Universal Studios in Orlando, even providing detailed descriptions of her job responsibilities and co-workers. However, when detectives accompanied her to Universal Studios to verify her employment, the elaborate lie fell apart. Casey led them through the theme park for nearly an hour, maintaining her story, before finally admitting that she had never worked there at all. The investigation into the mysterious babysitter Zenaida Gonzalez also yielded disturbing results. Despite Casey's detailed descriptions of this woman who had supposedly been caring for Kaylee for years, no evidence of her existence could be found. Phone numbers Casey provided were disconnected or belonged to other people, addresses were vacant or occupied by people who had never heard of Zenaida, and no one in Casey's social circle could confirm ever meeting this supposedly crucial figure in Kaylee's life. As investigators dug deeper into Casey's background, they discovered a pattern of deception that extended far beyond the immediate case. Friends and family members revealed that Casey had been lying to them for years about various aspects of her life, from her employment status to her relationships to her financial situation. She had borrowed money from multiple sources under false pretenses and had created elaborate stories to explain her constant need for cash. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Casey had been telling people different stories about Kaylee's whereabouts for weeks before the child was reported missing. Some friends had been told that Kaylee was with the babysitter, others that she was on vacation with Casey's imaginary boyfriend, and still others that she was staying with relatives. This web of contradictory lies suggested a deliberate effort to prevent anyone from realizing that Kaylee was missing. The announcement that 2-year-old Kaylee Anthony was missing sparked one of the largest missing child searches in Florida history. Hundreds of volunteers, including many from the local organization EquiSearch, joined law enforcement in combing through the Orlando area looking for any sign of the missing toddler. The search effort was complicated by Casey's constantly changing story about where Kaylee might be. Each new version of events sent searchers to different locations, from theme parks to shopping centers to wooded areas throughout Central Florida. The lack of credible information from Casey meant that searchers were essentially looking blindly, hoping to find some trace of the child without any reliable guidance about where to focus their efforts. Tim Miller, founder of Texas EquiSearch, brought his organization's expertise in missing person cases to Orlando to lead the volunteer search effort. Miller and his team conducted systematic searches of areas where Caylee might have been left or hidden, using both ground teams and specialized equipment. However, the vast area to be covered and the lack of credible leads made the search extremely challenging. The media attention surrounding the case attracted volunteers from across the country, with some people traveling hundreds of miles to join the search effort. The story of the missing toddler struck a chord with parents and grandparents nationwide, who could not imagine how a child could simply vanish without her mother immediately alerting authorities. As the search continued with no results, attention increasingly focused on Casey Anthony herself. Her behavior during the search period was widely criticized as inappropriate and suspicious. Rather than actively participating in the search or making emotional appeals for her daughter's return, Casey seemed more concerned with her own legal situation and media portrayal. The search effort was also hampered by false leads and hoax calls, some of which appeared to be deliberately misleading. The high-profile nature of the case attracted individuals seeking attention or trying to interfere with the investigation, creating additional challenges for law enforcement and search teams. On December 11, 2008, nearly 6 months after Caylee was first reported missing, the child's skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area less than half a mile from the Anthony family home. The discovery was made by Roy Kronk, a utility worker who was conducting routine meter readings in the area. Kronk had actually called police about the location several months earlier, in August 2008, reporting that he had seen what appeared to be a skull in the wooded area. However, the initial police response was inadequate, and officers who checked the area claimed to find nothing suspicious. This failure to properly investigate Kronk's initial report would later become a source of controversy and criticism of the investigation. When Kronk found the remains in December, they were contained in a black garbage bag along with duct tape and other materials. The location was in a swampy area that was sometimes flooded, which had contributed to the decomposition of the remains and the destruction of potential evidence. The proximity to the Anthony home immediately raised questions about who had placed the body there and when. The discovery of Caylee's remains transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide. The presence of duct tape near the skull led investigators to conclude that the child's death was not accidental but was the result of deliberate action. This evidence would become central to the prosecution's case against Casey Anthony. The forensic examination of the remains was complicated by their condition and the environmental factors that had affected them. Dr. Jan Garavaglia, the chief medical examiner for Orange County, determined that the manner of death was homicide, though the exact cause of death could not be determined due to the decomposition of the remains. The location where Caylee's body was found was significant for several reasons. It was an area that Casey Anthony was familiar with, having played there as a child. It was also close enough to the family home that someone could have easily transported the body there without being noticed. However, the area had been searched multiple times during the initial investigation, raising questions about when the remains were actually placed there. Understanding Casey Anthony's personality and psychological makeup is crucial to comprehending the events that led to Caylee's death and the behavior that followed. Mental health experts who examined Casey during the investigation and trial identified several personality traits and disorders that may have contributed to her actions. Casey exhibited many characteristics associated with antisocial personality disorder, including a persistent pattern of lying, manipulation, and disregard for the rights and welfare of others. Her ability to maintain elaborate deceptions for extended periods, her lack of remorse for her actions, and her apparent inability to form genuine emotional attachments were all consistent with this diagnosis. Perhaps most striking was Casey's apparent lack of maternal instinct or genuine concern for Kaylee's welfare. While she could present as a loving mother when it served her purposes, her actions consistently demonstrated that her own needs and desires took precedence over her daughter's well-being. This narcissistic focus on herself would prove to be a recurring theme throughout the investigation and trial. Casey's relationship with the truth was complex and disturbing. She appeared to be what psychologists term a pathological liar, someone who lies compulsively and often unnecessarily, even when the truth would serve them better. Her lies were often elaborate and detailed, suggesting significant planning and forethought rather than simple impulsive deception. The psychological evaluation also revealed Casey's desperate need for attention and validation from others. Much of her lying seemed designed to make herself appear more interesting, successful, or sympathetic than she actually was. She created fictional jobs, relationships, and life circumstances that painted her as more accomplished and desirable than reality suggested. Family members and friends described Casey as someone who lived in a fantasy world of her own creation, where consequences didn't apply to her and where she could reinvent herself at will. This disconnect from reality may have contributed to her ability to continue her normal social activities even while Kaylee was missing or dead. As evidence mounted that Caylee Anthony had been murdered, the investigation into Casey Anthony intensified dramatically. The Orange County Sheriff's Office, led by Detective Yuri Melich, conducted one of the most thorough and extensive investigations in the department's history. Every aspect of Casey's life was scrutinized, from her relationships and finances to her internet searches and daily activities. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence uncovered during the investigation was Casey's internet search history. Forensic analysis of her computer revealed that she had conducted searches for terms like chloroform, neck breaking, how to kill, and household weapons, in the weeks leading up to Kaylee's disappearance. These searches suggested premeditation and planning for violence, directly contradicting Casey's claims that Kaylee's death was accidental. The investigation also revealed Casey's extensive history of theft and fraud. In addition to stealing from her family members, she had been using stolen checks and credit cards to fund her lifestyle. This pattern of criminal behavior painted a picture of someone who was willing to break the law whenever it served her purposes, regardless of who was harmed in the process. Investigators conducted hundreds of interviews with Casey's friends, family members, co-workers, and acquaintances. These interviews revealed a consistent pattern of lying and manipulation in Casey's relationships. Multiple witnesses testified that Casey had told them different stories about Kaylee's whereabouts and that she had seemed unconcerned about her daughter's welfare. The forensic examination of Casey's car, which had been impounded from the tow yard, revealed additional crucial evidence. The strong odor that Cindy Anthony had described in her 911 call was analyzed by forensic experts, some of whom concluded that it was consistent with human decomposition. Air samples from the car's trunk were subjected to sophisticated chemical analysis that detected compounds associated with decomposing human remains. Physical evidence from the car included traces of chloroform, which corresponded to Casey's internet searches for information about the chemical. While the significance of this evidence was debated, it suggested that Casey had been researching and possibly using methods to render someone unconscious, potentially as part of a plan to harm Kaylee. From the moment Caylee Anthony was reported missing, the case attracted intense media attention that would only grow as the investigation progressed. The combination of a missing child, a seemingly unconcerned mother, and a web of lies created a story that captivated news organizations and the public alike. Nancy Grace, the CNN headline news host, became one of the most prominent media figures covering the case. Her nightly coverage of the investigation and her strong opinions about Casey's guilt helped to shape public perception of the case. Grace's emotional coverage, which often featured dramatic declarations about Casey's behavior and character, contributed to the intense public interest in the case. The 24-hour news cycle meant that every development in the case was immediately broadcast to a national audience. Casey's behavior, court appearances, and family dynamics were dissected endlessly by legal experts, psychologists, and commentators. This constant coverage created a situation where public opinion about Casey's guilt was largely formed before the trial even began. Social media platforms, which were still relatively new in 2008, played a significant role in spreading information and opinions about the case. Facebook groups dedicated to finding Caylee and discussing the case attracted hundreds of thousands of members. The case became one of the first major criminal proceedings to be extensively discussed and debated on social media platforms. The intense media coverage had several significant effects on the case. It made jury selection extremely difficult, as finding potential jurors who hadn't been exposed to extensive pretrial publicity proved nearly impossible. It also placed enormous pressure on law enforcement to solve the case quickly and on prosecutors to seek the death penalty to satisfy public demands for justice. The media attention also had profound effects on the Anthony family. Their home became a gathering place for protesters and media crews, making normal life impossible. Death threats and harassment forced the family into hiding, and the constant scrutiny took a severe toll on their mental health and family relationships. On July 16, 2008, exactly 1 month after Caylee was last seen, Casey Anthony was arrested and charged with child neglect, making false statements to law enforcement, and obstruction of justice. These initial charges reflected the evidence available at the time and Casey's obvious lies to investigators, though more serious charges were expected if Caylee was found dead. The arrest came after Casey failed multiple polygraph tests and continued to provide inconsistent and unverifiable information about Caylee's disappearance. Her story about the babysitter had completely fallen apart under investigation, and her inability to provide any credible leads in the search for her daughter had convinced investigators that she was involved in whatever had happened to Caylee. Following the discovery of Caylee's remains in December 2008, the charges against Casey were upgraded to first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The decision to charge her with first-degree murder indicated that prosecutors believed they could prove that Casey had planned and deliberately killed her daughter. The first-degree murder charge was significant because it made Casey eligible for the death penalty under Florida law. State Attorney Lawson Lamar announced that prosecutors would indeed seek the death penalty, citing the aggravated nature of the crime and the young age of the victim. This decision intensified the already considerable public interest in the case and raised the stakes for both the prosecution and defense. Casey's behavior following her arrest continued to raise questions about her mental state and involvement in Caylee's death. Jailhouse recordings of her phone calls with family members revealed a young woman who seemed more concerned with her own situation than with her daughter's fate. She complained about jail conditions, asked for money for commissary items, and showed little emotion when discussing Caylee. Casey Anthony's defense team, led by veteran criminal defense attorney Jose Baez, faced the enormous challenge of defending a client who was widely believed to be guilty by the public and whose own behavior had created substantial evidence of her culpability. Baez, who was relatively inexperienced in capital cases, assembled a team of experienced attorneys and experts to mount a comprehensive defense. The defense strategy evolved over time as the case progressed toward trial. Initially, the defense focused on challenging the physical evidence and arguing that the prosecution's case was purely circumstantial. They questioned the reliability of the forensic evidence, particularly the analysis of odors from Casey's car and the interpretation of the Internet search history. However, as the trial approached, Baez developed a more dramatic and controversial defense strategy. In opening statements, he shocked the courtroom and the watching public by claiming that Caylee had not been murdered at all but had died in an accidental drowning in the family's swimming pool. According to this new theory, Casey's strange behavior was the result of psychological trauma stemming from years of sexual abuse by her father, George Anthony. This defense strategy was risky and controversial for several reasons. It required the jury to believe that Casey had covered up an accidental death rather than reporting it, that George Anthony had been involved in the cover-up, and that Casey's behavior was the result of psychological damage rather than guilt over murder. The sexual abuse allegations against George Anthony were particularly explosive, as they had never been raised before and were vehemently denied by him. The defense also attempted to shift blame to other family members and to create reasonable doubt about Casey's involvement in Caylee's death. They suggested that other people had access to Casey's car and computer, that the evidence could have been planted or contaminated, and that the investigation had been compromised by media pressure and public opinion. Throughout the trial preparation and proceedings, Baez faced criticism for his handling of the case and his relatively limited experience with capital murder trials. However, his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and present alternative theories would ultimately prove effective in creating doubt in the minds of the jurors. The trial of Casey Anthony began on May 24, 2011, in Orlando, Florida, before Judge Belvin Perry, Jr. The proceedings were broadcast live on television and attracted massive public attention, with millions of Americans following every detail of the testimony and evidence presentation. The trial lasted 36 days and featured testimony from over 90 witnesses, making it one of the most extensively covered criminal trials in American history. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Linda Drain Burdick and State Attorney Jeff Ashton, presented a comprehensive case designed to prove that Casey Anthony had deliberately murdered her daughter and then engaged in an elaborate cover-up. Their theory was that Casey had killed Caylee because the child interfered with her desire to live a carefree party lifestyle. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, as there were no eyewitnesses to Caylee's death and the decomposed state of the remains made it impossible to determine the exact cause of death. However, they argued that the totality of the evidence, including Casey's behavior, her lies, the internet searches, and the physical evidence, painted a clear picture of guilt. Key prosecution witnesses included forensic experts who testified about the analysis of odors from Casey's car, computer specialists who detailed the internet searches, and family members and friends who described Casey's suspicious behavior during the 31-day period when Caylee was missing. The prosecution also presented evidence about Casey's financial problems and her resentment of the responsibilities of motherhood. The defense case focused on creating reasonable doubt about the prosecution's theory while presenting their alternative explanation of accidental drowning and family cover-up. Jose Baez's cross-examination of prosecution witnesses was aggressive and often effective in highlighting inconsistencies and limitations in the evidence. The defense called relatively few witnesses, focusing instead on challenging the prosecution's evidence and presenting their theory through cross-examination and closing arguments. The decision not to have Casey testify in her own defense was controversial but probably wise, given her history of lying and the potential for devastating cross-examination. On July 5, 2011, after deliberating for just over 10 hours, the jury returned verdicts that shocked the nation. Casey Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter of a child. She was convicted only on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers. The verdicts were met with immediate and intense public outrage. Millions of Americans who had followed the trial believed that the evidence clearly demonstrated Casey's guilt, and they could not understand how the jury had reached such conclusions. The courtroom itself was filled with gasps and expressions of disbelief when the verdicts were read. Judge Perry sentenced Casey to 4 years in prison on the misdemeanor convictions, but because she had already served nearly 3 years in jail awaiting trial, she was released just days after the verdict. Her release was conducted in secret due to safety concerns, as death threats and expressions of public anger had made her a target for vigilante justice. The jury's decision was based on their conclusion that while Casey's behavior was suspicious and morally reprehensible, the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that she had committed murder. Several jurors later explained that they found the circumstantial nature of the evidence insufficient to convict on the serious charges, even though they believed Casey knew more about Caylee's death than she had revealed. The jury foreman, who remained anonymous for several years after the trial, later explained that the jurors had struggled with the decision but ultimately felt that the prosecution had not provided enough concrete evidence to support a murder conviction. They were particularly troubled by the lack of a clear cause of death and the absence of direct evidence linking Casey to the actual killing. The Casey Anthony verdict sparked one of the most intense public reactions to a criminal trial verdict in American history. The immediate response was overwhelmingly negative, with polls showing that the vast majority of Americans disagreed with the jury's decision. Protests erupted outside the courthouse and at locations across the country, with demonstrators demanding justice for Caylee. Social media platforms were flooded with expressions of outrage and disbelief. The hashtag #JusticeForCaylee trended on Twitter for days, and Facebook pages dedicated to criticizing the verdict attracted millions of followers. The case became a cultural touchstone, with references to Casey Anthony becoming shorthand for perceived injustice in the legal system. The intense public reaction raised important questions about the role of media coverage in shaping public opinion about criminal cases. Many legal experts argued that the extensive pretrial publicity had created unrealistic expectations about the strength of the prosecution's case and had led the public to confuse moral certainty with legal proof. The controversy also highlighted racial and class dynamics in the American criminal justice system. Some observers noted that the intense public interest in the case was partly due to the fact that both the victim and defendant were white and middle class, suggesting that similar cases involving minority families might not receive the same level of attention or public sympathy. The backlash against the verdict extended to the jurors themselves, several of whom reported receiving death threats and harassment. The jury foreman was forced to go into hiding, and other jurors changed their names or relocated to escape public anger. This reaction raised concerns about the intimidation of jurors and the potential impact on future high-profile cases. The Casey Anthony case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, as there were no eyewitnesses to Caylee's death and the condition of the remains made it impossible to determine the exact cause of death. Understanding the evidence and its limitations is crucial to evaluating both the prosecution's case and the jury's verdict. The prosecution's evidence can be categorized into several key areas: Casey's behavior and statements, forensic evidence from her car and computer, the discovery and condition of Caylee's remains, and expert testimony about the circumstances surrounding the death. Casey's behavior during the 31 days when Caylee was missing was perhaps the most compelling evidence against her. The prosecution argued that no innocent mother would fail to report her child missing for such an extended period, and that Casey's party lifestyle during this time was inconsistent with genuine concern for her daughter's welfare. Photos and videos from this period showing Casey apparently carefree and enjoying herself were particularly damaging to her case. The lies Casey told to investigators were also significant evidence of her guilt. The prosecution argued that her elaborate fabrications about the babysitter, her employment, and her activities during the missing period were designed to cover up her involvement in Caylee's death. The sheer number and complexity of her lies suggested consciousness of guilt rather than simple confusion or trauma. The forensic evidence was more controversial and complex. The analysis of odors from Casey's car suggested the presence of human decomposition, but defense experts challenged the reliability of this evidence and the methods used to analyze it. Similarly, the Internet searches for information about chloroform and violence were suggestive but not conclusive proof of murderous intent. The condition and location of Caylee's remains provided important circumstantial evidence. The presence of duct tape near the skull suggested that the death was not accidental, while the location of the body near the Anthony home pointed to someone familiar with the area. However, the defense argued that the evidence was consistent with other scenarios, including accidental death followed by a panic-driven cover-up. The prosecution also presented evidence about Casey's financial problems and her resentment of parental responsibilities. Friends testified that she had complained about the restrictions that caring for Kaylee placed on her social life and that she had expressed a desire to be free of these obligations. This evidence was intended to establish motive for the murder. The Casey Anthony trial featured extensive expert testimony on various forensic disciplines, reflecting the circumstantial nature of the case and the need to interpret complex scientific evidence. The reliability and interpretation of this expert testimony became a central issue in the trial and contributed to the jury's ultimate decision. Dr. Arpad Vass, a forensic anthropologist from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, provided some of the most controversial testimony in the trial. Dr. Vass claimed that his analysis of air samples from Casey's car revealed the presence of chloroform and compounds associated with human decomposition. However, his methods and conclusions were vigorously challenged by defense experts who questioned the reliability of his techniques and the validity of his conclusions. The prosecution also presented testimony from Dr. Jan Garavaglia, the medical examiner who had examined Kaylee's remains. Dr. Garavaglia testified that the manner of death was homicide based on the presence of duct tape near the skull, though she acknowledged that the exact cause of death could not be determined due to the condition of the remains. Computer forensics experts testified about Casey's internet searches, providing detailed evidence about what she had been researching in the weeks before Kaylee's disappearance. The timing and content of these searches were presented as evidence of premeditation, though the defense argued that the searches could have been innocent or could have been conducted by other family members. The defense presented their own expert witnesses to challenge the prosecution's forensic evidence. These experts questioned the methods used to analyze the car odors, challenged the interpretation of the internet search data, and provided alternative explanations for the physical evidence found with Kaylee's remains. The battle of the experts highlighted the limitations of forensic science in cases where direct evidence is lacking. The jury was forced to evaluate competing scientific theories and determine which experts were more credible and convincing. The complexity of the scientific evidence may have contributed to the jury's decision to acquit, as reasonable doubt could be created by challenging the reliability of the forensic analysis. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came during Jose Baez's opening statement when he made explosive allegations about sexual abuse within the Anthony family. Baez claimed that Casey had been sexually abused by her father George Anthony from a young age and that this abuse had continued into her adult years. He further alleged that George Anthony was present when Kaylee drowned accidentally in the family pool and had helped cover up the death.